Hello, I am back. Today, I want to turn to a update on the Solomon Islands affair, as well as just a general talk about the election. First, let's start with the Solomon Islands. Penny Wong. This is a good place to start. This is where it's interesting because Penny Wong is acting as the foreign minister in which the Labour Party has been out of power for 10 years. What makes this ridiculous is that instead of trying to make up with things and make sure it's a generally stable environment, it seems that Penny Wong has already started to actually, of course, she made up for some things, but she has also been attacking Chinese influence as if it's necessarily not good. Yeah, and this is where I think the issue is. Then, at the same time, by then pushing on the regional security ideal, which I remind you, goes against why the Solomon Islands, for example, signed the agreement with China in the first place, because they wanted to just diversify security. Do I think our Labour government could fix the issue and ease some tension with some islands? Absolutely. But is it going to be a fix everything solution? No. That's one thing that's really critical to understand. And that is I think the issue here, because the media attention around it here was ridiculous as well. Because there's talking about a competing power, Wang Li and Penny Wong as competitors and fighters over influence in the Pacific, almost as if they are wanting to escalate a conflict and fight a war. It's just really annoying because that is that really how it actually is. For example, this is what Rungi actually said about the Solomon Islands. Wang said the two countries agreed to lay a solid political foundation for bilateral relations, build the Belt and Road Initiative, implement the Global Development Initiative, and jointly build a secure and stable environment. Something of note here is the Australian government in the past directly refused the Belt and Road Initiative. In the speech in Fiji, with the new Foreign Minister Penny Wong, she said, "As Australia's Foreign Minister, I commit to working with you and listen to you. This generation of Pacific leaders to navigate these challenges together, and Australia will be a partner that doesn't come with strings attached, nor impose unsustainable financial burdens. We believe in your transparency. We believe in your true partnerships. We will respect specific priorities and your institutions. We will support growth and development that is sustainable. But Australia alone can't necessarily do this. And there's no reason why Australia and China can't equally develop the Pacific as much. China never said at any stage that it wants a exclusivity over the Pacific. So then in turn, if any Australian lawmakers or others want to make out that China wants a exclusivity to it, no, that's not how it's working at all. I think it's like greater than that if they want to complain. Because if they want to really, really complain about that, especially with some anyway, it'd be about something completely different. For example, the Solomon Islands also made another thing. Oh, no. Do it. Countries that have yet to do that, to respect, and especially countries that are members of the United Nations, must respect the resolutions of the United Nations to recognize the one China principle. It is a 2 years and one very interesting GM. We progressed quite a lot of things that the government people of China have done, and should all the major cities in China, you don't see a homeless people. You do not see beggars sitting on the streets. And we are the work that is done in pulling people out of poverty. And also on the 29th of March, on 29th of March, he also, again, I said this in previous videos before, but I want to remind you, he was complaining about Australian media about how they were overhyping the Solomon Islands Chinese pact. Let me try and find a point in it. We have no intention of pitching into any geopolitical power struggle. To suggest that is simply ludicrous. As a sovereign country, we will continue to collaborate and ensure what what the Solomon Island needs in its security space are addressed collectively. Moving forward, to achieve our security needs, it is clear that we need to diversify our country's relationship with other parties, and what is wrong with that. That is what we were taking to deal with here. And also, there was actually a article put out, which has an interesting point. It was published in 2014, but it's still interesting. And it says a clear point on this, which I'll elaborate on. where it says at the end, Taiwan is geographically designated describing an island in the middle of the first island chain in the Western Pacific. It is incorrect to equate the two distinctive things as things, a government and an island. That is a very clear point in which, and I mention that is because some people will use what the Solomon Islands said regarding the One China policy as a excuse to not trust Chinese influence. Because there is a very paranoia, especially in some circles here, about China. Australian media themselves has put up Taiwanese separatism many, many times already. So is it like a huge surprise that sort of statement is going to be a huge issue for some? Well, no. Also, one thing I want to make very clear here is the technical ideology of the Labour Party. I'm using I'm going to switch to a very broad definition initially and expand on it. Here we go. Labourism. The dominance of working class, a political, social, or economic system that favors such dominance, support for workers' fights. That is, technically speaking, correct. Labour governments tend to do that, but it misses out one point entirely. That Labourism came from a rejection of socialism. That Labourism comes with the cravat that it fully accepts capitalism, it fully accepts private companies' interests, it fully accepts everything that comes with it. Also, making it then not always able to do what is needed. That is a critical feature you have to understand. The Labour Party of the United Kingdom and Australia follow Labourism. That is that definition. Labourism and liberalism come from the same ideological root, fundamentally. Both came from a rejection of socialism. Both came from a rejection of rebellion. Both came from a rejection and wanting to avoid any radicalism in the Cold War period. So is it any massive surprise that's what I'm saying. Don't be surprised if some policies or actions are basically similar to the Labour Party in regards to this. And in this regard, the Global Times actually did a good article, which I will now show. In 2 seconds. Here. Published May 27th. Since May, the US has escalated the promotion of its so-called Indo-Pacific strategy and launched a diplomatic offensive around China. The Pacific region has been unilaterally listed by the by the US, in this Indo-Pacific strategy as a key part. And this is where history of the Liberal National Coalition, being so anti-China and so supportive of the US is going to be a testing ground for the Labour Party in many, many ways. And this is where I need to also mention some comments by Anthony Albanese at the Quad meeting also shows that this whole trend might not change, as we saw. It can say, amongst all the accusations made by the US and Australia to smear and attack Wang's trip to the South Pacific, the most absurd version that is that cooperation between China and South Pacific countries will trigger a new Cold War. By saying that, they are exposing themselves. But we can understand the various behaviors of the US and Australia from this perspective, as strongly warned them to not introduce a new Cold War into the South Pacific, but Asia Pacific and anywhere in the world. One of the reasons why China's relationship with the South Pacific countries can develop so fast is that everyone refuses to fall into Washington's playbook, and it is even more that everyone refuses to fall into Washington, and it is ever more impossible for them to be confined to circles determined by Campbell. The people of the Pacific Islands hope to be respected and live a good life. The local people have made money by working in Chinese enterprises, and the living standards have improved significantly. They ask themselves, what did we do in the islands countries before? The US and Australia can be themselves as much as possible, but times have changed. Eventually, they'll realize who is the one actually unwelcome in the Pacific. And again, this is why I'm saying if their party really, really wants to fix this, they can. We'll change the government. And if they really, really want to, they can foster a good relationship and have a joint development of the Pacific. The Solomon Islands in China and everyone else involved has not excluded Australia. And if anything, the many Chinese netizens online, when they say comments about Australia, about how to not negotiate with Australia, if the Labour Party fucks up this could cause a heavy impact. And that is the key issue here. The Australian election also, this is where I find it ironic, is the conservative Chinese Australian base who betrayed the Liberal Party actually assisted in having the Liberal Party lose. So this is where I think needs to be really careful. And to finish off, let's just go what is the one China policy, because this does actually really matter in this context. I'm using, here we go, white paper. The one China principle is the foundation stone for the Chinese government policy on Taiwan. On Conway's Deng Xiaoping initiative, the Chinese government since 1979 adopted the policy of peaceful unification and gradually evolved the scientific concept of one country, two systems on this basis. The after-mentioned principles and policies in embodying the basic stand of the spirit of adhering to the one China policy and fully represent Taiwan compatriots to wish to govern and administer Taiwan by themselves on on January 30th, 1995, President Jiang Zemin put forward 8 proposals: development relations between the two sides of Taiwan Strait, proposal of peaceful unification of China, explicitly pointing out adherence to the one China policy is the basis and prerequisite for peaceful unification. No country maintaining diplomatic relations with China should provide arms to Taiwan or enter into military alliance with any form of Taiwan. All countries maintaining diplomatic relations with China should abide by the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and refrain from providing arms to Taiwan or helping Taiwan produce arms in any form under any context. Or pretext. That is what it is. Because there isn't necessarily a two-China policy like there is a two-Korea policy. That I think is the biggest confusion with some people. Is that, thank you speaking as well, in terms of the Taiwan Island end, they haven't scrapped it necessarily. I mean, they still have the ROC Constitution, for example. As long as they have the ROC Constitution, it says they are a government of China, essentially. It's the ROC, technically speaking, but that's that. And of course, there's some. Then it's expanded now to a greater issue entirely, but that'd be something else entirely. But what it does matter is Australia and the US and other people might not understand this at all well anywhere near enough to really get to the core point. Some might see this sort of stuff as a threat, as China trying to be imperialist by trying to be a bully. But is it really bullying? Ask yourself, is it really that? The issue is about other things, because ultimately, the reason why the Pacific Islands and other people went against the wishes of the US and Australia to some degree was because Australia was under many years of an incompetent government who cared nothing for climate change when the islands they're on collapsed. Are suffering from climate change. That matters usually here, as this is now a circumstance in which we really need to be super, super careful. China is actually trying to help the situation, trying to develop these countries and trying to get them into a good situation with sustainability. Australia is now pledging the same thing. So why can't they both do it? If both genuinely have a desire to develop the Pacific, let both do it. Let both Chinese and Australian initiatives help. And it's not like the Solomon Islands and other Pacific states have totally scrapped Australian security agreements in all cases, have they? Either. They haven't. And that is what matters here. The issue is now something entirely different. Will Australia abandon the Cold War mindsets that clouded the judgment of previous leaders under the 10-year rule of the Liberal National Coalition. And that's your question here. Will the foreign ministry end be genuinely helpful to Pacific? Or will it just be a rebranding of Pax Americana? That is your question. And that's the question we'll only see over time, ultimately. The establishment of relations between China and Australia, and now China and the Pacific, is there. The Australian government can't not recognize that. But also, the Australian government can't be all going to hissy fit if China wants to develop. Because there's nothing in there saying that Australia has exclusive rights to develop those areas. If everyone says that, they are just acting in a very colonial manner. Let's not. And that's what Australia needs to do now. Australia needs to avoid falling in a trap of colonial mindsets. Because if they fall into a trap of a colonial mindset, then they'll fall into a trap of the previous 10-year coalition. Then the relationship won't heal. And if anything, then Australia will be the cause of a divide in some cases. If Australia can't respect and understand that some in the Pacific want to do deals with other people for security reasons, that is something that is not the fault then of the Pacific Islands. That's then fault of the government not understanding that there's still anxiety around this. I honestly hope that everybody heals this and repairs things. But am I holding out hope necessarily for it? No, not really. Because for them to do that, they'll need to make huge sacrifices. And in many regards, it would be political suicide. At least in Canberra. Because the Liberal Party still retained 30% of the Senate, because the Senate works differently in terms of election cycles. It's a 6-year term compared to a 3-year term for the House of Representatives. And with that, I am going to end it with the final message being Anthony and Penny needs to get this correct. They need to actually put peace first. Political bias and Cold War mentalities last. For the US, of course, they'll put Cold War mentality first because they are the one wanting to preserve power. But Australia itself is a middle power. We have the ability to actually do something and contribute something properly to things. And Australia also needs to understand the world's changing. The US's influence is slowly declining. And China's role in globalization in some aspects is increasing. So then if Australia wants to keep going on ranting about how China's evil and oppressive and all this, even under new government, it's only going to backfire in the long run. And I really, really hope that doesn't happen. Because especially with this relationship, especially with the circumstance. And with that, I'll sign off.